could just explain to the people listening sort of who you are and a little bit about your background.
Sure. I'm a former barrister. In England, there are two types of lawyer, solicitor or barrister. Barrister does the work, legal work, mainly in the courts and represent clients in the courts. It's a profession divided between solicitors and barristers in this country. And I used to be a barrister, but now I'm working full-time on other issues. And one of those issues is Satanist ritual abuse, which I have worked on for the last 27 years. How it started was when a British MP, Member of Parliament, approached me about a Satanist ritual abuse case that he had been approached about, and asked me to get involved because he knew that I was involved in campaigning for children's rights. And I've done a lot of work over the last 27 years on children's rights issues, including child sex abuse, but also SRA. And it started from there. That was in January 1993. So more than 27 years now, I've been following this issue of SRA, speaking out on it, campaigning on it, sometimes writing articles, doing interviews, speaking at conferences, trying to get the word out, because this is a very hidden issue. And this is what makes it so difficult to deal with sometimes, is the general public's ignorance of the issue or disinterest in the issue, or sometimes their knee-jerk reaction of skepticism, which makes it difficult to get them to take action on the issue.
So explain, what exactly is SRA?
Satanist ritual abuse is a brutal form of mistreatment that is inflicted on children or vulnerable adults, and it involves psychological, physical, and sexual abuse, and it is done in the context of Satanist rituals. And it is normally, in most cases, done not as a one-off incident, but as a repeated form of abuse over a period of time, usually a period of years, that the victim is subjected to SRA. So it inflicts huge damage on the survivors. Some of the people who are subjected to SRA do not survive, unfortunately. Sometimes they are murdered as part of the ritual, usually in a ritualistic way. We call that ritual sacrifice. And it is the Satanist rituals and the Satanist beliefs that encompass this, what I would call atrocities against children and vulnerable adults. It's sex abuse and torture combined together, and it's repeated over and over. And it's hell, basically, for the victims who have to go through this. And when they come out at the other end, if they survive, and they try and tell their stories to others, usually they are victimized a second time by people rubbishing what they're trying to reveal and saying that can't be true, or you're telling lies, or you're delusional. And I would refer to that as a secondary form of abuse. So one thing that makes it so hard for the public to accept is because it's so awful. It's unimaginable horror. But it does exist. I think throughout human history, we have many examples of people thinking that, oh, well, we've already reached the depths of human depravity, can't get worse. Unfortunately, it does get worse. So there was a time in the UK, for example, not that long ago, when even child sex abuse was disbelieved, because people found that too horrible to accept and just didn't want to believe that it was true, and the victims of child sex abuse who were trying to report it were disbelieved and were scolded or warned not to repeat their allegations again. And now we have the same kind of disbelief, in many cases leveled as SRA, although I'm pleased to say that the public interest in SRA and willingness to seriously consider it as a real issue is starting to shift in the right direction, at least in the UK. I know you have a struggle in America as well over this issue, but I think one advantage America has is that it's a more open society than the UK, and it's easier to talk openly about these subjects over there than in the UK or other parts of Europe.
So what was it like, or how did you become aware of this for the very first time? And
well,
who made you? Yeah. So I was basically just saying, like, who made you aware of it, and what was the situation?
Well, I had heard about this subject before January '93, when I first started working on it, and I had done some reading on the subject. So when I was asked to take on this issue, I wasn't totally unaware of what SRA consisted of. But in a way, I was thrown in at the deep end because I was asked to meet a group of SRA survivors who were being treated by a doctor, and all of them had dissociative identity disorder, DID, which used to be known as multiple personality disorder. So I saw some adults, for example, in front of me, shifting from their core adult personality to a little child personality that caused them to talk in a very different voice, act in a very different way. These fragmentation of their core personality into all these different, what we call alters, alternative personalities, is actually a survival mechanism more than a disease. It's not a disease, it's not a mental illness, it's a survival mechanism that victims of SRA, especially children, use, because what they're subjected to is so horrible, it's so horrific, that mentally a child cannot cope. So what they do is they fragment their mind into other personalities to cope with the torture and the abuse, and they let that personality bear the brunt of the suffering, and that enables the core personality to remain safe and distanced from it. So in many of these cases, you will find child personalities who exist still at the time which they were created. So for example, there may be a case of an SRA survivor who formed a child personality in 1974, for example, when that person was being subjected to SRA. And many years later, that child personality may come up, for example, during therapy, and still think, in that child personality, he or she will still think that it's 1974. There's also sometimes what you could call a guardian personality, who is like the bodyguard there to help protect the core personality. And that guardian personality can be very aggressive and overly assertive. And if it's a female, it might even take the form of, if it's a female core personality, the guardian might even take the form of a male to add to the aggressive nature of that alter. So it's a sad fact that about 80% of people suffering from DID are SRA survivors. That means the majority of DID sufferers have DID because since childhood they were subjected to the most horrible abuse and torture by Satanist abusers. And the end result, the only way they could mentally cope and survive was through the fragmentation of their core personality into all these different personalities.